Picture a man at the very top of his craft. 2 NBA championship rings on his fingers. The reigning king of the three-point shot. A player who had just won the three-point contest at All-Star Weekend 3 years in a row. 1990, 1991, and 1992. Nobody in the league could match that. And yet, at 32 years old, with that resume sitting right there in plain sight, Craig Hodges could not get a single one of the 27 NBA teams to offer him a contract. Not one. Now, you have heard stories like this before. A career ends because a man's knees give out. A career ends because the talent fades, the legs go, the shot stops falling. Or a career ends in scandal, the kind of trouble that swallows a man whole. But that is not this story. Craig Hodges still had the shot. The film proves it. The numbers prove it. By the cold math of shooting a basketball, he was one of the best the game had ever produced. And he simply disappeared. So what happened? The answer, according to Hodges himself, traces back to a summer afternoon at the White House. A handwritten letter, 8 pages long, and a refusal to keep his mouth shut about the struggles of Black America. In 1996, he took that belief into a federal courtroom, filing a $40 million lawsuit against the NBA and all 29 of its teams, claiming he had been blackballed for speaking out. That is the question that drives this entire film. Did one of the purest shooters in basketball history lose everything because of what he believed and what he dared to say out loud? Before he was the man banished from the league, he was a kid from a small Illinois town who simply could not miss. And to understand the ending, we have to go back to where the shooting started. Craig Anthony Hodges came into the world on June 27, 1960, in Park Forest, Illinois. If you know the map of the Chicago area, you know Park Forest, a planned suburb that rose up south of the city in the years after the Second World War, built for working families looking for a piece of the American dream. It was the kind of place where a boy could spend an entire afternoon on a driveway hoop and nobody would call him in until the streetlights came on. And that is exactly the kind of boy Craig Hodges was. The thing about elite shooting, the kind that wins contests and decides playoff games, is that it is never an accident. It is repetition. It is thousands upon thousands of shots taken alone, in silence, long after everybody else has gone home. The mechanics, the follow-through, the discipline to do the same boring thing 10,000 times until it becomes automatic. That discipline was already taking root in him as a kid. And here is the thread worth holding on to. The very same discipline that built his jump shot, that stubborn, relentless devotion to a thing he believed in, would one day get applied to his convictions too. Park Forest sat close enough to Chicago that the city's basketball world was practically in his backyard. That matters, because the boy from this quiet suburb would grow up, leave home, travel across the country, and then come full circle, returning to that very Chicago basketball world wearing a Bulls uniform, chasing championships in the shadow of the city he came from. But a small-town shooter needs a stage. And in 1978, he found one all the way out in California, under a coach whose name would echo through the rest of his life. In 1978, Craig Hodges took his game west, enrolling at Long Beach State, where he would play college basketball through 1982. And the man waiting for him there would turn out to be one of the most important figures in his entire story, a coach named Tex Winter. Now, if that name rings a bell, it should. Tex Winter was a basketball mind ahead of his time, an architect of offense who believed the game should be played a certain way, with movement, with spacing, with every player touching the ball and finding the open look. For a young shooter like Hodges, landing under a coach like Winter was a gift. It sharpened the technical foundation of his shooting, demanded precision, and rewarded exactly the skills Hodges had been building since those Park Forest driveways: the ability to space the floor and knock down the shot when the ball found him. But here is the detail that ties this whole life together, the one you cannot forget. Tex Winter would coach Craig Hodges again. Years later, when Hodges landed with the Chicago Bulls, Winter was there too, serving as an assistant under head coach Phil Jackson. The same offensive philosophy Winter taught at Long Beach State became famous in Chicago, the system that helped turn a great team into a dynasty. So the thread runs straight from his college years to his championship years, stitched together by one coach. Winter understood what Hodges could do, because Winter had been shaping it since the boy was 18. When the 1982 NBA draft finally arrived, the league's scouts saw the shooting clearly enough, but they made him wait, far longer than a player of his future should ever have had to wait. When his name was finally called in the 1982 NBA draft, Craig Hodges heard it in the third round, 48th overall, selected by the San Diego Clippers. 48th. Let that number sit with you for a moment. A man who would go on to win 3 straight three-point contests and 2 NBA titles was, on draft day, an afterthought, a late-round gamble, a name read off near the bottom of the board, long after the league had spent its big picks on flashier prospects. There is a psychology to being picked that low, and it shapes a man. A third-round selection does not walk into the NBA with a guaranteed role and a long leash. He walks in fighting for every single minute. He knows that one cold stretch, one bad week, and he could be gone, replaced by the next hopeful in line. That kind of pressure either breaks a player or it sharpens his edge. For Hodges, it sharpened it. It gave him a chip, a hunger, a sense that he had to prove the scouts wrong every time he stepped on the floor. And so it began, in San Diego, with a Clippers organization that was struggling, far from the bright lights and contention. It was not a glamorous start, but it was a start, the opening chapter of what would become a 10-season journey through the NBA. The overlooked kid from Park Forest had his foot in the door. San Diego, though, was only the first stop. It was in Milwaukee that Craig Hodges would first prove he could decide an entire playoff series with his own 2 hands. The move to the Milwaukee Bucks is where Craig Hodges began to become the player history would remember. Across his career, he would suit up for 4 franchises: the San Diego Clippers, the Milwaukee Bucks, the Phoenix Suns, and the Chicago Bulls. But it was in Milwaukee that the shooter truly found his role and his footing in the league. Think about what a rotation guard with a deadly jump shot offered a team in that era. Spacing. The threat of the shot pulled defenders out of the paint, opened driving lanes, and bent a defense the moment Hodges crossed half court. He was the kind of player coaches love to have on the floor in the final minutes, a man with the nerve to take the big shot and the touch to make it. And the numbers backed up the reputation. Over the course of his career, Hodges would lead the entire NBA in three-point shooting percentage not once, but twice. That is not luck. That is the Park Forest driveway and the Tex Winter classroom paying off at the highest level of the sport. But there is always a label that follows a man like this: specialist. A shooter, they say, and only a shooter. The kind of player who can heat up a game, but cannot truly change one when it matters most. Hodges carried that label, the way every great shooter does. The question hanging over him was whether he could be more than that when the lights were brightest and the stakes were highest. In the spring of 1986, with a playoff series on the line against Philadelphia, Hodges did something specialists almost never get to do. He won the deciding game. The 1986 Eastern Conference semifinals put the Milwaukee Bucks against the Philadelphia 76ers, and it was the kind of series that does not let anybody breathe. 7 games, 2 teams trading punches, the whole thing coming down to one final night. And right in the thick of it stood Craig Hodges, doing far more than just spotting up for jump shots. Look at what he did across those 7 games, and the specialist label starts to crack apart. Hodges averaged 14.1 points, 4.6 assists, and 3.3 steals per game. Read those numbers again, because the steals are the part nobody expects. 3 steals a night against a battle-tested Philadelphia team means he was guarding, anticipating, reading passing lanes, putting his hands on the basketball. 4.5 assists means he was creating, making plays for teammates, running the offense, not just standing in a corner waiting. This was a two-way contributor in the highest pressure setting the sport offers. And then came Game 7, the deciding game, the night that separates the players who fold from the players who deliver. Hodges poured in 24 points, and he scored the basket that won it, the game winner. With the season hanging by a thread, the ball found the man from Park Forest, and he buried it. That is not the line of a role player who disappears when the stakes climb. That is a man who took the biggest moment of the series and made it his own. It should have been a defining performance, the kind of game that follows a man around for the rest of his career, told and retold every time his name came up. And yet, somehow, history let it slip. That clutch reputation, though, traveled with him, and it would soon land him exactly where every shooter dreams of being, alongside the most famous player on the planet. In 1988, Craig Hodges arrived in Chicago, and the timing could not have been more perfect. He would play for the Bulls through 1992, joining a team on the rise, a franchise building towards something the city had never seen. At the center of it all stood Michael Jordan, already the most electrifying player in the game, with Scottie Pippen growing into a star beside him. And Hodges fit the blueprint exactly. A great scorer like Jordan draws defenders the way a flame draws moths. Defenses collapsed on him, double-teamed him, dared anybody else to beat them. And that is precisely where a shooter like Hodges earned his keep. Park him on the perimeter, let Jordan and Pippen bend the defense, and when the ball kicked out, Hodges punished them for sagging off. He was the spacing, the release valve, the man who made the whole machine harder to guard. It was the role he had been built for since those long afternoons in the driveway. And there was a familiar face waiting for him in Chicago. Tex Winter, the same coach who had shaped him at Long Beach State, was now an assistant under head coach Phil Jackson. The teacher and the student reunited at the highest level, inside an offense designed to reward movement and shooting. The basketball part of the story could not have lined up more neatly. But there was another Craig Hodges walking into that locker room, the man underneath the jump shot, a man with deep convictions about his community, about responsibility, about what it meant to be a black athlete with a platform. Most players who reach a championship team learn quickly to keep their heads down, to blend in, to let the stars carry the story. But Hodges arrived in Chicago already convinced of something different. That silence, for a man in his position, was a kind of betrayal. If you want to understand just how good Craig Hodges was at the one thing he did best, look no further than the three-point contest at All-Star Weekend. Because for 3 straight years, 1990, 1991, and 1992, nobody on the planet could outshoot him. 3 titles in a row, a streak that put him in company so rare you can count the members on one hand. To this day, only 3 players have ever won 3 of those contests: Larry Bird, Damian Lillard, and Craig Hodges. Sit with that for a second. Bird, one of the greatest to ever lace him up. Lillard, a modern superstar. And Hodges, the 3rd round pick, the man scouts made wait until 48th overall. He belongs on that short, exclusive list, and he earned every bit of it under the bright lights with the whole league watching. And the records he set tell the rest of the story. In 1991, Hodges drained 19 consecutive shots, 19 in a row without a miss. That kind of streak is almost unthinkable, a level of precision that turns a competition into a clinic. And back in 1986, he had already posted 25 points in a single round, another contest record. These are not soft numbers. These are the cold, hard marks of a man operating at the absolute peak of his craft. The proof that when it came to shooting a basketball, very few human beings who ever played the game could match him. So here is a player with 2 championship rings, 3 straight shooting crowns, and a place in the record book alongside legends. By the cold math of shooting, he was one of the greatest in league history, which makes what happened next so impossible to explain by talent alone. In 1991, the Chicago Bulls reached the mountaintop. The franchise won its first NBA championship, and Craig Hodges was right there as a member of Michael Jordan's first title team. For a man who had started his journey as a late third-round gamble, bouncing from San Diego to Milwaukee to Phoenix before landing in Chicago, this was the summit, the ring, the validation, everything those thousands of solitary jump shots had been building toward. This was the professional high point of his life, a champion at last, part of a team that would soon be talked about as one of the greatest ever assembled. And with a championship comes tradition. The winning team makes the trip to Washington, takes its place on the lawn, shakes hands with the most powerful person in the country, and poses for the photographs that get framed forever. It is a celebration, a victory lap, a moment of pure pride. For most players, it is simply a nice day, a story to tell the grandkids. But Craig Hodges was not most players, and the White House, the very symbol of the establishment, the seat of American power, was about to become the dividing line of his entire existence. Everything in his life can be split into 2 halves, before that day and after it. The shooter who could not miss, the 2-time champion, the man on the short list with Larry Bird. All of that came before. What came after would be something else entirely. When the champions lined up to meet the President of the United States, every Bull wore a suit, except one. And what he carried in his hand would follow him for the rest of his life. The day the Bulls arrived in Washington to celebrate that first title, the scene played out the way these things always do. Handshakes, smiles, the team gathered together as champions. But one man stood apart from the rest. While his teammates wore the expected suits and ties, Craig Hodges showed up dressed in a dashiki, the traditional West African garment, a deliberate and unmistakable statement of who he was and where his heart lived. In a room built around American power and tradition, he chose to wear his identity on his back. And the dashiki was only the beginning. Hodges had come to that visit carrying something far more pointed than a fashion choice. By his own account, he had written a letter by hand, 8 pages long, addressed directly to President George H.W. Bush. And he delivered it. Not a speech to the cameras, not a quote tossed to a reporter on the way out. A handwritten document passed along to the office of the most powerful man in the country. What did those 8 pages say? By Hodges' own telling, the letter spoke to the concerns of minority communities and the poor, the people he believed were being left behind. It urged the president to turn his attention inward, to engage with the struggles of African Americans as seriously and as actively as his administration engaged with foreign policy abroad. The message, in essence, was this: you have power, and the people back home need you to use it for them. It was respectful in form, but unflinching in substance, the kind of thing a man writes only when he genuinely believes it has to be said. Think about the nerve that takes. A role player, not a superstar, standing inside the White House and quietly handing the president a list of grievances on behalf of his community. There was no guarantee anyone would even read it, but Hodges did it anyway, because for him, this was never about being noticed. It was about being heard. Years later, Hodges explained exactly what he was thinking when he handed that letter over, and his own words reveal a man who knew the risk he was taking. In 2017, sitting down for an interview with WBUR's Only a Game, Craig Hodges put his own thinking into words, and what he said cut straight to the center of who he was. Listen to how he framed that moment at the White House. "You know, I'm not coming with my hat in my hand," he said. "I'm just saying, man, take a serious, critical look, because you the man. And you being the man, I think I need to share this is what I had to say at this point in my life. So here it is, brother, and I hope you get a chance to read it." Read that quote slowly, because every line of it tells you something. I'm not coming with my hat in my hand. That is a man refusing to beg, refusing to shrink himself, refusing to play the grateful guest. There is pride in those words, and there is defiance. But notice what else is there: respect. He calls the president the man, acknowledges the office, the power. He is not there to insult anybody. He is there to deliver a truth and to ask, plainly, that it be considered. And then that final line, "Here it is, brother, and I hope you get a chance to read it." There is something almost gentle in it, almost humble, a man simply hoping his words land. That is the whole contradiction of Craig Hodges in a single sentence. Bold enough to challenge the President of the United States, but doing it with the tone of one man speaking honestly to another. This is the key to understanding everything that follows. The dashiki and the letter were not a publicity stunt. They were not a play for attention or a moment staged for the cameras. They came from conviction, a deep, personal sense of mission that Hodges carried with him everywhere. He believed he had a duty, and he acted on it, fully aware that powerful people do not always welcome being told what they ought to do. But the letter to the president was only one front, because inside his own locker room, Hodges was already challenging the most powerful athlete in the world. By the early 1990s, Michael Jordan was not just the biggest star in basketball. He was one of the most famous human beings on the planet. His face sold shoes, drinks, and dreams in every corner of the world. And to most people, that fame was the prize, the reward for greatness. But to Craig Hodges, that fame was something else entirely. It was a platform, a megaphone of almost unimaginable power, and in his eyes, Jordan was choosing not to use it. So Hodges said so, out loud. He criticized his own teammate, the face of the franchise, for refusing to lend his enormous voice to the social and political issues facing Black America. Jordan, Hodges argued, was bailing out, stepping away from a responsibility that came with all that influence. In Hodges' view, a Black athlete who had risen to the very top owed something to the communities he came from, and staying silent in the name of business and image was a kind of surrender. Now think about what it meant to say that, and where he said it. This was not some outsider sniping from a distance. This was a role player on Jordan's own team, inside the most watched franchise in the sport, openly questioning the choices of the league's untouchable superstar. Jordan's entire approach was built on a careful neutrality, the famous idea that everybody buys sneakers, so why pick a side? Hodges stood for the exact opposite. To him, picking a side was the whole point. It was a collision of two philosophies of fame. One man saw his platform as something to protect and monetize, to keep clean and universal. The other man saw it as a weapon. The other saw a platform as something you are obligated to spend on the people who need it most. They wore the same jersey, chased the same rings, and could not have been further apart on what it all meant. And according to a later podcast investigation, Hodges didn't just criticize Jordan in words. He asked him to do two extraordinary things that no superstar of that era would dare. In 2022, a Ringer podcast series hosted by the veteran basketball journalist Jackie McMullen pulled back the curtain on just how far Hodges pushed his superstar teammate. According to that account, Hodges did not simply complain about Jordan's silence. He brought him bold, concrete proposals, the kind of asks that would have sent shockwaves through the entire sports world. The first was about Nike. Hodges, by this account, urged Jordan to walk away from the shoe giant that had made him a global icon and to start a brand new athletic wear company, one staffed and built by minorities. Stop and consider the scale of that request. By the early 1990s, Jordan's partnership with Nike was already one of the most valuable relationships in the history of sports marketing. Hodges was asking him to leave all of it behind and pour that influence into building something for his own community instead. The second ask was even bigger. According to the podcast account, Hodges urged Jordan, along with Magic Johnson, to lead a boycott of the 1991 NBA Finals. The reason? To protest the beating of Rodney King by officers of the Los Angeles Police Department, an act of violence that had shaken Black America to its core. Imagine the two biggest stars in the game refusing to play on the sport's grandest stage as a statement of protest. It would have stopped the country cold. And how did Jordan respond? By the account in that series, he ignored the Nike idea entirely. And he told Hodges flatly that the boycott was a non-starter. Not a maybe, not a let me think about it, a closed door. In that single exchange, you can see the whole gulf between these two men. One willing to risk everything for a cause, the other unwilling to risk the thing he had built. But Hodges' politics didn't stop at race and money. When the country went to war, he stood almost alone in his own locker room once again. By the early 1990s, the United States had gone to war in the Persian Gulf, and a wave of patriotism swept through the country. Flags everywhere, yellow ribbons on doors, support for the troops printed on everything from television screens to gas station windows. In moments like that, dissent is not popular. Going against the grain takes a particular kind of backbone, and Craig Hodges had it. The well-known book, The Jordan Rules, the inside chronicle of those Bulls teams, captured the scene. Hodges openly opposed the Gulf War, voicing his objections inside a locker room where most of his teammates simply did not see it his way. Picture that for a moment. A championship team, riding high, mostly lined up with the national mood, and one man standing off to the side, saying out loud that he disagreed. It was the same Craig Hodges the country had seen at every turn, unwilling to swallow his convictions just because the room around him leaned the other direction. But here is the detail that matters most, the nuance you cannot skip past. According to that same account, his teammates disagreed with him, and yet they did not shun him for it. They could argue politics, take the opposite side, shake their heads at his positions, and still treat him as one of their own. There was room inside that locker room for a man to be different. His views did not cost him his standing among the players who shared the floor with him. And that distinction becomes the quiet heartbreak of this whole story. The men who knew him best, who sweated beside him and chased rings with him, could live with who he was. They did not freeze him out. They did not erase him. That tolerance, that basic human acceptance of a teammate who thought for himself, makes what came later land even harder. Because teammates could live with his opinions, but the front offices that ran the league, it seemed, could not. And the 1992 title would be his last act in an NBA uniform. In 1992, the Chicago Bulls did it again. A second straight NBA championship. Another summit reached, and Craig Hodges was right there as part of it. Still a contributor, still a man who could come off the bench and bend a defense with the threat of his jump shot. And remember what else he was at that exact moment. The reigning three-point contest champion, fresh off his third title in a row at All-Star Weekend. 2 rings on his hand, the shooting crown still on his head. By every visible measure, his career was in a good place. And then, just like that, it was over. After the 1991-92 season, the Bulls waived him, cut him loose. A 2-time champion, the best long-range shooter in the contest field 3 years running, released at around 31 or 32 years old, an age when plenty of role players still have good basketball left in them. Hodges himself believed he could still help a team.
He was not a man limping off the floor on ruined knees, not a player whose shot had abandoned him. The skill was intact, the resume was glittering, and the door closed anyway. Now, getting waived by one team is not, on its own, a scandal. It happens. Rosters change, roles shift, younger players come along. If another club had simply picked him up, this would be a footnote, a veteran shooter changing addresses, nothing more. That is how it works for a man with his credentials. But that is not what happened. Instead, the silence was total. No team called, no offers came, not from a contender looking for shooting, not from a rebuilding club looking for a steady veteran, not from anybody. 27 franchises, every one of them in need of players who could shoot, and not a single one wanted the man who had just won the three-point contest 3 straight times. That is the riddle at the center of everything. How does a champion shooter, still in his prime years, vanish from the league without a sound? What happened next at All-Star Weekend turned suspicion into a story, because the league nearly erased a 3-time champion from his own signature event. The three-point contest had been Craig Hodges' stage, the place where he stood above everyone, the event he had owned 3 years running. So when 1993 rolled around, you would expect the reigning champion to be invited back to defend his crown. That is the obvious thing. That is how it should have gone. Instead, he was left off the field entirely. The reason given was procedural, almost clinical. Hodges was not on an NBA roster. No team, no spot in the contest. And there it is again, that same maddening fact. The man could still shoot the lights out, but because no franchise would sign him, the league's logic said he no longer belonged in his own signature event. The very thing that had defined him was being taken away on a technicality that existed only because nobody would give him a contract. Eventually, there was a reversal. Hodges was allowed to compete after all. But look at how he competed. With no team to call his own, he could not wear anybody's colors. So he stepped onto that floor in a plain, generic jersey marked simply NBA. No city, no franchise, no home. A man without a uniform, defending a crown he had won 3 times, dressed in the basketball equivalent of an empty name tag. And the result carried its own quiet sting. Hodges was eliminated in the semifinal round, finishing behind eventual winner Mark Price and Terry Porter. The 3-time champion knocked out before the final in a blank jersey, watching others take the stage that had once been his alone. It is hard to imagine a more pointed image of where his career had landed. A champion present but unattached, allowed in the building but claimed by no one. A reigning 3-time champion in a blank jersey, unwanted by any of the league's teams. To Hodges, that was not bad luck, and 4 years later, he would say so in a courtroom. For 4 years after that lonely night in the blank jersey, the question sat unanswered. Why had the offers dried up? Why had a champion shooter been frozen out at 32? Hodges had his own answer, and in 1996, he stopped whispering it and put it on the public record. He filed a lawsuit, and the figure attached to it was enormous, $40 million, aimed at the NBA and all 29 of its teams. This was the moment private suspicion became a formal, documented accusation. Up until then, a man could dismiss Hodges' belief as bitterness, as the wounded pride of a player who could not accept that his time had passed. But a lawsuit is different. A lawsuit is filed in a courthouse, sworn and signed, naming names and laying out claims that the other side has to answer. Hodges was no longer just talking. He was making his case in the one arena built to test exactly this kind of charge. And what was the charge? At its heart, the suit claimed he had been blackballed, deliberately and collectively shut out of the league. The stated basis was twofold.
First, his association with Louis Farrakhan, the controversial leader of the Nation of Islam, a figure whose name alone made many in the establishment uneasy.
And second, his outspoken criticism of wealthy black athletes, the same drumbeat he had carried for years, the insistence that those who had made fortunes owed something to the poor and the disenfranchised they had left behind. In other words, Hodges was arguing that the very things that defined him, his beliefs, his associations, his refusal to stay quiet, were the reasons the league had cast him out. Not his age, not his shooting touch, his convictions. The lawsuit drew a straight line from the dashiki, the letter, the challenges to Jordan, the war protest, all the way to an empty phone that never rang. The lawsuit did not stop at a general accusation. It named specific conversations and specific executives, and that is where the story gets uncomfortably concrete. When the lawsuit landed, it carried something more than a sweeping charge against the league as a whole. It pointed fingers at particular people and recounted particular conversations, the kind of detail that turns a broad complaint into something far more pointed. And two names stood out. The first belonged to Jim Clemens, then an assistant coach with the Bulls. According to the claims laid out in the suit, Clemens told Hodges that the team was troubled by his criticism, specifically his repeated insistence that players were not doing enough for the inner-city communities they came from.
Now, hold this carefully, because it is an allegation made in a legal filing, not a finding proven in any courtroom. But if that account is accurate, it would suggest the very thing Hodges had long believed, that his words, his refusal to let the subject drop, had become a problem inside the organization that had just won back-to-back titles with him on the roster. The second name pointed west, to Seattle. The suit referenced Billy McKinney, at the time the director of player personnel for the Seattle Supersonics, and pointed to the question of Seattle's interest in signing Hodges. Here again, the wording matters.
This was a claim, an account offered from one side of a legal dispute, and the versions of what actually happened may differ depending on who is telling it. The suit framed it as evidence of a door that opened and then mysteriously closed. And this is exactly where a case like this runs into a wall. Proving a blackball is one of the hardest things to do in any court of law. A blackball, by its nature, leaves no paper trail. Nobody signs a memo announcing it. There is no contract that says, "Do not employ this man." It lives in phone calls, in hallway conversations, in decisions that each team can always explain away with perfectly ordinary reasons. His age, his role, the math of a roster. To win, a player would have to show coordinated intent across an entire league, and that bar is enormous. The silence that haunted Hodges was real, but silence in a courtroom is devilishly hard to convict. A blackball is one of the hardest things to prove in any court, and what the legal system decided about Craig Hodges would shape how history remembers him. In the years that followed, Craig Hodges never softened his version of events. He told and retold the story, and over time it crystallized into a single, unforgettable line. Speaking in later interviews, recounted by outlets like Fadeaway World and Yardbarker, Hodges put a price tag on that day in Washington. The jump shot, the gesture, the dashiki, the letter, all of it had, in his words, cost him $50 million. The career, the contracts, the years he believed were stolen from him, distilled into one stark figure. It is a powerful way to frame a life. In Hodges' telling, the line connecting cause and effect is clean and unbroken. He spoke out, and the league shut him out. The activism was the crime, and exile was the sentence. To him, there was no mystery to solve at all. He knew exactly what had happened and exactly why. But fairness demands we hold up the other version too, the one offered by some in sports media who look at the same facts and reach a different conclusion. By that reading, what ended Hodges' career was not conspiracy, but arithmetic. He was 32 years old. He was a specialist, valued almost entirely for his shooting,
a limited defender in a league always hunting for younger, more complete players who could do more for the same roster spot. Teams, in this version, simply made a cold basketball calculation. The production no longer justified the slot. No plot required, just the ordinary, unsentimental churn that pushes role players out of the league every single year. So which is it? Conviction or coincidence? That is the tension that refuses to resolve. On one side stands a man with 2 rings and 3 straight shooting crowns, frozen out the very moment his political profile peaked.
On the other stands a perfectly mundane explanation that has ended 1,000 careers without a hint of scandal. The honest truth is that the evidence allows both readings, and no court ever settled the question for certain. You can line up the timeline and feel the chill of suspicion, or line up the roster logic and see nothing but business as usual. Whatever ended his playing days, Hodges refused to disappear quietly, and the chapter after basketball reveals what kind of man he really was. Here is the part that tells you the most about Craig Hodges. After the offers dried up, after the lawsuit, after the blank jersey and the courtroom and the years of silence, he never took it back, not one word of it. A lesser man might have quietly recanted, might have softened his positions to make himself employable again, might have decided the convictions were not worth the cost. Hodges did the opposite. He doubled down on being exactly who he had always been. In the decades since, he has kept telling his own story on his own terms, in features and interviews that let the man speak for himself. In a profile with Slam, in long conversations like the one he gave on the All the Smoke podcast, the same figure shows up every time. Unbowed, unapologetic, a self-described activist who decided long ago that the struggles of his community mattered more than any contract ever could. He did not reinvent himself as a victim looking for sympathy. He stood by the choices, costs and all. And time has a way of reshaping how we see a man like that. Place Hodges in the longer arc of athletes who use their platforms to speak on race and justice, and his story reads differently than it did in 1992. The conversations he was having back then about wealthy black athletes and what they owe, about using fame for something larger than sneakers and endorsements, those conversations would echo loudly through later generations of players who picked up the same torch. What once got a man labeled a troublemaker came to look in hindsight like a man who was simply early. That is the trade at the center of his life. He had everything the league valued in a player, and a path to the kind of fortune most people only dream of. He set it down, or had it taken from him, in the name of a belief he would not abandon: the contract or the conscience. Hodges chose the conscience, and he has spent the rest of his life refusing to pretend he chose wrong. Which leaves us with the only question that has ever really mattered in this story, and the answer says as much about the NBA as it does about Craig Hodges. So lay it all out on the table and look at it plainly. The shooting credentials are not in dispute. 3 straight three-point contest crowns from 1990 through 1992. 2 championship rings, one in 1991 and 1992. A place on a record list shared with the rarest names in the sport. The letter to the president was real. 8 pages handed over in person. The activism was real. The challenges to the most famous athlete on earth were real. And the timing of his sudden, total exit from the league was real. None of that is in question. What remains in question is the one thing that would close the case for good. The blackball was never proven. The lawsuit made its claims, named its names, and laid out its conversations. But the legal system never delivered the verdict Hodges was looking for, and the steep hurdles of proving league-wide intent meant the central accusation stayed exactly where it began, unresolved. We are left then with 2 columns. In one, the documented facts, the records, the rings, the letter, the silence that followed. In the other, the unproven charge that the silence was deliberate. And that is the honest place to land.
especially for those of us who watched this era unfold and remember how the league talked about men who would not stay in their lane.
Here was a player who possessed in abundance the exact skill the NBA prized most, a shot that almost never missed under pressure, and who lost his place in the game right after he refused to be quiet off the floor. Maybe it was punishment. Maybe it was nothing more than age and roster math wearing a sinister mask. The facts permit you to believe either one, and they do not force your hand. What is certain is this: Craig Hodges decided, at the height of everything he had built, that his voice was worth more than his comfort. He paid a price for it that he is named in the millions, and he has never once asked for it back. That choice, not the rings, not the records, is what makes his name worth remembering. The records are real. The letter was real. The silence that followed was real. So you decide. Was Craig Hodges blackballed or simply forgotten? Tell us where you stand in the comments. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who remembers when he could not miss.